that. And same kind of things that I'm sure many of the people in the Atlanta Track Club have been dealing with, of training hard, then having their hopes dashed that a race that they were planning for wasn't happening.
How do you keep them motivated? How, as a coach, I know that, you know, a lot of people think of writing workouts and administering workouts, but part of it is the mental toughness too. How do you keep athletes wanting to get out there every day when there's no races to be run?
Well, like you said, mental toughness, which is a key part of any distance runner, and even I suppose a sprinter, but really counts for a lot more when you're doing long stuff. So if you're going to be out there for 10 or 20 or 30 hours, then a lot of that is going to be mental. It's not usually going to be the body that's the weakest link. So in many ways, I try to formulate this as, if something went wrong in a race, how do you cope with it? How do you overcome it? It's the same kind of mentality you have to deal with things here in the real world as well. And it's the same kind of thing you'd have in a marathon, but it's just so much more extreme in ultras that I try to formulate any negative into a positive, which means the difficulties of economic issues, family issues, just the medical side of things, and worrying about whether you or friends will get ill, is the kind of thing that we all need to be able to cope with. But it's an unexpected thing, like in a race, if you're not going quite to plan. Let's say it's a marathon, for example, to put it in a context that more of your club would be able to put it in, which is that if you're running a marathon, you're sticking to your pace goals, you've got a good idea of what you should be able to do, and then you hit a hill, suddenly you feel like you're blowing up, or you're hitting the wall at mile 20 and you're struggling. How do you keep yourself positive? How do you keep yourself motivated? And how do you look at it as a challenge that is a good thing rather than a negative that just brings you down and demoralizes you? So that is, I think, a really big part of ultra running. One of the best things about it is the way that that transfers to normal life. So I was actually surprised about how many of the runners that I coach have dealt with this really well. Obviously, some lost their jobs, but even those ones were able to roll with the punches probably better than your average person because of the skills you get from long distance running.
Anecdotally, it feels like more people are running. Are you seeing that?
Oh, definitely.
I mean, I'm sure everybody runs in Bend anyways, but do you see more people running, and are you getting more coaching inquiries?
There were fewer coaching inquiries at first because obviously people were worried about, firstly, not being able to train for a race, and secondly, jobs and not wanting to pay for something that may be more of a luxury, to be honest. But I coach people all around the world, and so do my other coaches in my company. So we typically have seen the whole variety there, from, say, South Africa, where they had complete lockdown and they couldn't even leave their house, through to people who would be having a little bit more flexibility, or, to be honest, in many parts of the US, having very little change to lifestyle other than things like races being cancelled and restaurants not being open. But there are definitely more people outdoors, and that's continued, I think, everywhere around the world where people have been allowed outside. And then when they have been allowed outside after a lockdown, it's zoomed up because everyone wants to get out of the house.
I want to talk a little bit about your background. You've run more than 200 ultras and marathons. You got 4 wins at the Leadville Trail 100, 9 top 10s at Western States. That's a really impressive resume. Ultra marathoning, trail running, marathoning, a really niche sport. How did you get into this sport?
I saw a TV show. Simple as that. I was 24, 25 years old. I'm now 39. And I saw a TV show about the Sahara Desert, and it was a race called the Marathon des Sables, which is a 7-day stage race. And I happened to know someone who'd done it. And so that gave me a little bit more of a context for what it was like. But I just thought, I'm living in London. So as you can tell, I don't come from Oregon originally. I am American and British dual nationality now. But back then I was living in London, and I just thought, I'm not getting enough exercise. Probably a common thing a lot of people in Atlanta find. It's just running is one of the easiest forms of exercise to do. You just need to buy a pair of shoes, and that's it. You can do it on your own. You can do it out of your front door. So I kind of just got the bug from thinking I'll do this epic race in the desert. Maybe sounds weird. The first thing I did was a massive hardcore ultra. But if you look at it from the perspective of wanting an adventure, and I wasn't a runner beforehand. It wasn't like I'd done track at college or anything like that. I'd played other sports, but if you're not doing as much exercise, maybe getting stuck in the office more and in the pub more as well, then you start thinking running is a pretty good option that is the simplest way to stay healthy and have a challenge. So I just got hooked on it at that point.
I think you bring up a good point, because I think a lot of people see running as one sport, and there are so many sub-sports within the sport of running. A 5K and a marathon, very different. A marathon and an ultra marathon, very different. You talked about the mental toughness that it takes to run 20, 30 hours, but what about the physical training? How is the physical training for an ultra marathon different than the physical training for a marathon?
I think people would be surprised that it's not that different. So if I'm preparing someone for even a 100-mile race, the volume of what they're doing is not necessarily that much different to a marathon. I'd say that the main thing is the focus on specifics. So if you're training for a mountainous race, you've got to get in more hills. If you're training for something that's going to be going through the night, you've got to be practicing using your headlamp and stuff like that. Or if it's hot or other factors, you've got to get those elements in there close to race day. But the volume doesn't necessarily need to be that different. In fact, I'd argue that the volume may be a little bit lower, like for like, between a professional marathoner and a professional ultra runner, or between an amateur marathoner and an amateur ultra marathoner, because of the fact that it's more about time than distance. If you're running on a road and you're doing 8-minute miles, let's say, that might be equivalent to running 12-minute miles on a rolling trail. So if you did the same amount of miles, you'd be doing a lot more time. So typically I'd say it's actually not as difficult for people to get into as they think. They may assume that if they did 50 miles a week to do a marathon, they've got to do 100 miles a week to do an ultra. Not the case at all. There's a little bit of change in the long runs, but a lot of the same core things are the same. I mean, physiologically, your body is going through the same type of thing from the mile up to the 100 miles. So there's a lot more similarities there than people might realize.
You mentioned that the conditions in some of these ultras are a lot more grueling than, say, a hilly marathon. And I know you coach people all over the world. When you're training for a marathon, it's generally easy to find a terrain that replicates the race you're training for. If you live in London or New York City or even here in Atlanta and you're training for something like Leadville, how do you help people really kind of replicate that experience the best they can when it's hard to find terrain that matches that?
Well, the good thing is what I just mentioned, which is that much of the training can still be similar. You can still have standard speed sessions. You can still have track workouts. You can still have long runs that are flat. But you just got to try and find other ways to get those other elements in there. So if it's hills and you need to be training for mountains, but you live in a dead flat city, then treadmill, uphills, parking lots with multi-story, tall buildings with stairs. All of these work well. Plus weight vests are a very good backup as well, because they build a bit more leg strength. So not running with it, but just hiking with it. And then that's also doing another element of ultras, which is practicing power hiking, which I think to a road runner is the thing you do when you've given up. It's the thing you do when everything's gone wrong, is you start walking. It means your race is bad. While to an ultra runner, the mentality is a little bit different, that you've got to be able to do that kind of thing. If you're in 50 miles into a 100 miler, you're going up a 30% gradient and it's 100 degrees, you're going to be hiking it. Doesn't matter how good you are. You've got to be able to do that. So you can still mimic most of those things no matter where you live. Although the more similar your terrain is to the type of race you're doing, probably the more fun it'll be. If you live somewhere completely flat and you pick the hardest, most difficult high altitude mountain race, then you're going to be spending more time on a treadmill and more time doing things that are a little bit more awkward. But you can train for any type of race anywhere in the world. It's always possible.
I want to talk about why you're here tonight. One of the things that's been talked about a lot over these last couple of weeks and months is the lack of diversity in distance running, and the call on leaders of the running community to affect change in that area. You see that lack of diversity in trail running and ultras maybe more so than we do in even the marathon and road racing world.
Definitely, yeah. I think road running at least is a little bit more open because it's typically in big cities and it's the type of terrain that the mass of the population can easily get to. More people live in cities and places like New York, Atlanta. There's going to be clearly a lot more road groups you can join, and there's going to be just a more diverse community in those cities too. So ultra running is definitely a very white sport. I don't think it's not aiming to be inclusive. I don't think it's not friendly to everyone, but there just aren't as many people in it already who are from other backgrounds other than being white. And so that was highlighted even more as I think everyone's been reflecting on their own lives in recent weeks and months. And so I thought, what could I do to maybe have a practical little bit of improvement to the world and the part of the world that I'm in? And I thought, okay, well, I'm a coach, so why don't I make it more inclusive by offering some free coaching spots to people from the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community. And ultimately, we've done that. We've had a few of those spots have already gone. 6-month coaching spots we're offering. And I've got one left with myself that I'm saving for someone from Atlanta. So in tandem with you guys. So we'll be doing this every 6 months as well to offer another 6-month introductory element to it. But the idea being that we are encouraging people to join us who are already runners, but maybe they've decided or haven't thought about trails, haven't thought about ultras because it just wasn't something they know anyone who already does, that kind of thing. So my aim was just to make it seem that much more possible, make it more welcoming, and then for people to see that it is a good place to be. And it's also a natural place, I think, for a lot of distance runners to go, especially after they've maybe peaked for a few years at road racing. A lot of people then pick longer distances where they can still see improvements, even if they're not setting their PRs anymore. But this applies to any age. Really, the idea is just getting people who are new to trails or ultras and introducing them to it.
There's a lot of great runners, great coaches in the ultra community. You're obviously one of them. But why did you feel compelled to answer this call? Why is this important to you?
I think personally, I was thinking through all the stories I was reading, all the stuff on the news, everything in newspapers, and I thought, well, it's one thing to say I'm going to try not to be racist. I'm going to try and be an anti-racist. And that's a very small thing, to be honest, that hopefully each and every one of us can do to some degree, but it needs to be a little bit more than that. It needs to be a bit more proactive. And so I was just trying to think of something useful. The example I use is if I were a lawyer, I'd be offering some pro bono services to maybe black protesters in the recent protests who got arrested. So maybe it'd be that kind of thing. But given the part of the world that I work in and my expertise, it just seemed like the natural way to try and just broaden that one element of it, just trying to do little things. And if everyone does little things, hopefully that makes the world a nicer place to be in, and somewhere where we can all accept each other a bit better. So it's no big grand gesture. It's just thinking, what is a practical and useful thing that I can do given my personal skill set?
So this spot, as you said, there's a spot open for someone here in Atlanta. Just the person who signs up knows nothing about ultra running, has never run an ultra run, much like you hadn't when you watched the TV show. What can they expect over these 6 months?
Yeah, so they get calls every 2 weeks. They'll have a training plan along the way. There's emails back and forth to give them guidance. And really, it's just to think that you don't need to have any experience of this. All we ask is that someone is already running. If the most you've run is a 5K, that is fine. We're not asking for someone who's already an elite marathoner and they want to take it to the next step. Just someone who maybe thinks it could be fun to be out on the trails or be fun to try something beyond the marathon. So it's really just the fact that we'll be guiding that process. So we do one-on-one coaching. And so some of my other coaches have already had their runners start with them. And it's been actually really fun for us, to be honest, as well, because we've had some really enthusiastic runners wanting to get into the community. And this is just a way to overcome part of that hurdle of not knowing people within it and potential cost related to getting into it, and not wanting to spend money on something where, particularly coaching, if there's something you've never done before or that's dramatically different, people aren't likely to pay for that as much. It's
a tight-knit community. I know, hundreds of thousands of people do marathons every year, but when you go to the start line of one of these big ultra races, and there's not hundreds of thousands of people there, there's dozens, and you've probably seen them before at other ultra races you've been to. Can you talk a little bit about the community feel within the ultra running community?
Definitely. No, I think what you say there is pretty much true, that obviously ultras are smaller. I think the numbers are something like 1 million people run a half marathon each year in the US. And the latest numbers are about 90,000 or 100,000 run an ultra. And that's of any distance. That's including everything beyond the marathon. And there's bound to be some duplicates in there. I think that's just the number of finishers. So it's clearly much smaller. Most races are more like 50 or 100 people, which does give it a more enjoyable community feel. I'm sure a lot of people have found that when they know people from a running club such as yours, they then have people when they go to any races where they automatically have a community. It doesn't matter where it is. I used to be a member of a running club in London called Serpentine Running Club. And so we had, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 members. It was the biggest club in the UK. And it meant that I was guaranteed that any race I went to, almost in the world, especially a big one, I could have some people there from the club and just get in touch with them. So ultra running is a bit like that, apart from you actually know more of the people because it's a much tighter knit community. And it is very friendly. Trails and ultras, in the same way that with, say, cycling, I think the mountain biking community is probably a little bit more relaxed, a bit friendlier than the road biking community. Same kind of thing typically with ultras, that just a bit more chilled out. If you've been at the start line of most road races, there's not as much chat. People have their serious face on and they're thinking about their splits and maybe aren't talking quite as much in that starting corral. Ultras, it's more like you are running with friends the whole time. I've actually met a lot of people during races where I'm maybe 20 miles in, running next to someone, just chatting to them for a while, and then they become friends for life. So it's an incredibly welcoming community, but it is just not very diverse. But it's not because we discourage anything. It's more just that's how it is, and it takes a bit of time for things to change.
Right. It takes people to get in and spread the word and do things like you're doing. And I think we talked about it earlier in the conversation. It's hard to sometimes train when you don't have a race, but ultra running being smaller fields in their races, do you think we'll see ultra races come back before we see some of the bigger marathons come back?
Oh, undoubtedly. There have already actually been quite a few ultras that have happened. In Utah in particular, there have been several since the end of May. There's actually a trail marathon in the town that I live in next month. There's lots of races going on in the trail community that are much smaller. Some of them have very strict rules to allow for the COVID restrictions. So for example, there's a 50K and 50 miler in New York State this week where you're not allowed to race it unless you live in New York State. So no out-of-staters, it's about 50 people. They're doing it in starting corrals of 2 people at a time. So every few minutes, another 2 people go off. So it's so much easier to do that if it's a small race than if you've got 10, 20, 30,000 people running. So that's another benefit, that if you want to do races, there'll be more of these small races available than there will be before the road marathons come back.
Is that the Finger Lakes Ultra you're talking about?
No, that's the Cayuga.
Oh, the Cayuga Lake. Okay, it's one of the Finger Lakes. My hometown. So but if I'm ever going to run an ultra, that's going to be the one. But I don't know. I might have to go watch that movie you watched to get me out the door. So
it's actually a TV show, but it's amazing how many things, especially nowadays on YouTube. If you just look up any race, maybe it's a desert race, maybe it's a beautiful mountain race, it really is very inspiring. And I think the biggest thing that I'd encourage people to think about if they're considering ultras and trails is that there's so much more variety. So on the roads, you've got the New York Marathon, the Boston Marathon, the London Marathon. They're reasonably similar. Yes, they've got nuances, they've got their own hills and things like that, but it's kind of the same thing. If you look at a desert race versus a jungle race versus an Antarctic race, these are all completely different experiences. You can travel the world and get every type of thing in there. So that was actually what got me into it. It was the idea of the travel and the adventure as opposed to the running element being fun. Then I got hooked on the running as well. But it is really just a great way to see the world and also to explore your local area. Maybe people in the Atlanta area haven't really seen that much outside the borders of the city, but once you start doing trail races, you get to see a lot more of that and can appreciate it a hell of a lot more too.
They're not all the Barclays Marathon, because I've watched that one.
No, there are some really extreme ones, but they're not all that bad. Don't worry. It's even being on trail, I think some people are scared of tripping over. They think, oh, it's I'm going to injure myself, I'm going to twist my ankle. Once you get used to it, it's like any element of running. You improve and it all pays off. So it's not that much different. It's not that scary. It just takes a case of trying it out, basically, and that's what we're hoping to be able to help with.
I'm going to get the details on that in just a second, but I have to ask you before I let you go. You have an absurd number of Guinness Book of World Records for running marathons in costumes. Tell us just a couple of the costumes that you run marathons in.
It's the same kind of principle. I like doing different things. So I got into it in 2007 to do an Elvis marathon world record at the London Marathon because they offered £1,000 to the first Elvis. And I thought, I'm doing loads of marathons. Why not do a different one this time? And then that got me into doing a few others. But I've done
the first 3 or 4. How many Elvi were there?
They had 4. And I'm not sure if it's Elvises or Elvi. It depends on how much you like your Latin, I think. But so that was the first one. Then I did Elvis a few other times, including in Vegas, which was kind of fun. Also done Santa, which is a difficult one because you've got a big beard. Not easy to eat gels through a fake beard. Also did Maximus from the movie Gladiator, running around Rome and the Colosseum with that silly mask he has on and waving a plastic sword. And the one other one, Spider-Man. So I've done that a few times around the world as well.
What's your fastest marathon in a costume?
2:40, I think, as Spider-Man.
So that's 6-minute pace in a Spider-Man costume is
just about, yeah.
It's pretty impressive. Okay, so you've got one more spot left. It's for someone here in Atlanta. 6 months of coaching from Ian Sharman, a 4-time Leadville Trail 100 winner. How do people apply?
Simple thing is just look on the website sharmanultra.com. There is a contact form, and that's Charmin. It's like Sherman, but with A's, not E's. Or just Google Ian Charman Coaching and you'll find my website. Just contact me via that. It does now say on it that it's closed. That is, it's closed to anyone apart from in Atlanta. So I'm just saving up one spot for you guys because we filled the other ones. And that's it. Just send me a couple of sentences about yourself and why you'd like to get into it. The more enthusiastic you are, the better.
SharmanUltra.com. We're going to put this up on YouTube tomorrow. We're going to put the whole thing up on the distance.atlantatrackclub.com. and you'll be able to find all that information. We'll put it in the video link, so you'll be able to find all that. Ian, thanks so much.
And just to let people know, we're going to choose that person by the end of July. So depending on when they watch this, but we will be doing it again every 6 months. So if you miss out this time, maybe it gets you thinking about it. And then by the time it gets to December, January, you might want to apply then.
Great. Well, thanks for doing this. Thanks for talking to us tonight. And maybe I'll see you out there on the Ultra Trail one time.
Thank you, Jay. Well, I'd like to run Atlanta one time. The marathon there sounds pretty cool.
Anytime, just let me know.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ian. Have a good night.